elected officials in the state to provide kind of some independent information for transportation policymaking. And I would say this is a really exciting time to be in the transportation policy area. With automated and connected transportation coming to the fore, you know, the policy realm is so expansive. There are many topics and questions that our decision makers will be wrestling with, and so it really is an exciting time. Now, most of the attention tends to focus on the regulatory area, and we had some of that discussion this morning. A number of speakers talked about states passing legislation and regulations on automated vehicle use on public roadways. That's certainly a dynamic area. There's a lot of different approaches to that and a lot of interest in how do we harmonize that. But you know, even at the federal level, there's questions about vehicle safety standards, about spectrum, which I think the next panel is going to talk about. So within that regulatory realm, there's a lot going on. And I think maybe it was Gary who asked a question about what's going on with all of these policy questions. And there is quite a bit that's being looked at in all these areas. But for today, what I want to do is kind of put the regulatory part aside and to talk about the theme for the conference, which is infrastructure for connected automation, and have a conversation about another important policy lever besides regulation, and that's the investment of public dollars. And this is a topic that's not discussed as much in the policy circles that I'm involved in. I think that John set us up really well in his opening remarks for this, because in our present context, in general, transportation agencies are trying to do more with less. Revenue sources are strained, but we are hearing a renewed interest in infrastructure investment at the federal level. How that plays out and how smart infrastructure fits into that is yet to be known. And more what we're hearing about is public-private partnerships as a tool in this discussion. So through this conference on infrastructure for connected automation and through the different sessions, you're hearing about infrastructure needs, including roadway assets, such as enhanced pavement markings or signing or state of good pavement repair, connected traffic signals, telecommunications infrastructure, other supporting operations elements, including traffic management centers, mapping, public data sources. We heard earlier today a mention of infrastructure right-sizing. You know, how might the footprint change in the future, which could obviously change the investment picture. And then, of course, there's research, investment in research. So really the question we're trying to look at today is public dollars are going to play a role in all of these areas, but exactly how? So what we're fortunate to have three policy thinkers and doers on our panel today. And the way we structured this is to hear really what's going on from different levels of government. Because there's funding and investment that happens at federal, state, and local level. And so let me just introduce our speakers real quick. We have Melissa Tooley, who's Director of External Initiatives at TTI. She's filling in on short notice, but I appreciate her being here to give a federal perspective on funding. Of course, we have John here. You heard from him earlier, Director of Arizona DOT. He's offering a state perspective. And we have Carla Taylor, who is the Chief of Staff for the Department of Transportation at the City of Austin, giving the local perspective. And so each one of them are going to provide some brief remarks, and then we're going to have a conversation about some of the themes that emerge. So get your questions ready. I'm hoping they're not going to cut us off too early, but I do want to have some interaction with all of you. And I know there are people in the audience here who are really dealing with this directly. I know there's some state DOT directors here and MPO representatives, so it'd be good to hear kind of what the different perspectives are. So with that, I think we'll start with Melissa, and if you would, give us a federal perspective.
Thanks, Ginger, and I really do appreciate the invitation to speak to you this afternoon about this topic. So I'm going to talk about the federal perspective on funding for automated and connected vehicle technologies. I'll talk a little bit about the executive branch, what's going on there, the legislative branch, and then I'll talk about the FAST Act and what some of the opportunities through the FAST Act are. I do want to note that there are opportunities available from some of the other agencies besides DOT. Due to time constraints, we won't talk about the things that are going on at DOE and some of the other agencies. But I think we have a lot to talk about with DOT, and that is the federal agency that you think about first when you think about transportation issues, obviously. First of all, you know, the dust is starting to settle from the election. We've all heard the talk about the $1 trillion infrastructure investment. The details are a little scarce on what exactly that means and how we're going to pay for it, but the rhetoric is looking positive. And I want to share with you a quote that Secretary Cho stated at the National Governors Association conference in February, and that is, the new automated technologies have the potential of dramatically changing commercial transportation and private travel, expanding access for millions within our borders. Automated technology has the potential to help eliminate human error and reduce crashes and fatalities significantly. Now, for the Secretary of Transportation to go on the record publicly with such a positive statement is a good sign. We're still waiting on the appointment of administrators and a lot of other people that actually get things done where the rubber hits the road at DOT, but I have to say that the rhetoric on the front end does look positive for the adoption of these technologies by the new administration at the executive level. As far as Congress is concerned, as a lot of you know, we're under a continuing resolution right now. The existing appropriation legislation expired last Friday, and in order to avoid shutting the government down, a one-week continuing resolution was passed last Friday. They were unable to come to an agreement on the new appropriations bill in time to keep that from happening. Now, the continuing resolution expires tomorrow. So there's a lot of feverish work going on in DC right now on the new appropriations bill. And there's a lot of things that could happen in those dark, smoke-filled rooms as they decide which programs are going to continue and how they're going to fund everything. However, as of the word coming down is that Congress is sticking to the FAST Act, that as of just the other night, all of the transportation programs authorized by the FAST Act were fully funded at their authorized levels, and that if there was an increase authorized over consecutive fiscal years, that the increases were authorized too. We don't have any way of knowing for sure until an appropriations bill passes tomorrow or whether there's going to be another continuing resolution. But the good news is Congress seems to be sticking with the work that they did when the FAST Act was passed in 2015. So we don't expect to see a lot of changes happening through appropriations. And there are things that they can do to stop existing programs, you know, simply by not funding them, or add new programs, or even change the nature of the programs entirely through appropriations. So far, we have seen no indication that they're going to do that. So that's good news too. Now, as far as the FAST Act is concerned, and the FAST Act is Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. That is the authorization legislation that funds pretty much everything that DOT does. There are some FTA programs under Commerce, but generally speaking, the FAST Act authorizes the programs at US DOT. There are two types of programs that I'm going to talk about here today. The first is grant programs, and the second is what I call formula programs. Now, the grant programs are typically awarded at the US DOT level. They are nationally competitive. There's a lot of different grant programs. I'll talk about the ones that pertain specifically to automated and connected vehicle technologies. But that's a great source of opportunity if you have a project where you want to install some of these technologies in your area, or if you're looking to partner with someone who's eligible under these grant programs. The second group is formula programs. Those are typically administered by local and state agencies, MPOs, state DOTs. The funding for these various programs is apportioned by formula. There's different formulas for each program. And there's no way I could go through all of them, but I will use some of them as an example of what you can do through these programs to support automated and connected vehicle technologies and implementation and deployment. So first of all, probably the biggest grant program is the ridiculously acronymed Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technologies Deployment Program, or the ATCMTD. I will refer to it as the deployment program in the interest of time. That one is actually active right now. It is the only grant program that I found that includes specifically automated vehicle technologies, which we usually think of as being something done by the private sector. Usually the public sector is more involved in V2I type technologies, things that are infrastructure based. So that particular program, the deployment program, is authorized at $60 million a year for each of the 5 years of the bill from 2016 to 2020. The purpose, as described in the Act, includes advanced transportation technologies. And the eligible activities under that grant, there's a list of them, but one of them is advanced safety systems, including V2I and V2I communications, and technologies associated with AVs and other collision avoidance technologies, including systems using cellular technologies, which is very, very specific. There are some other grant programs that kind of imply that these technologies are eligible. This one calls it out specifically. This grant is active now. I'd be surprised if there aren't some people in this room that are working maybe on one of these grant applications. Those proposals are due on June the 12th. The next one I want to talk about is FASTLANE, which stands for Fostering Advancements in Shipping and Transportation for the Long-Term Achievement of National Efficiencies. Probably one of the more clever acronyms we've come across recently. It's authorized at $800 million for fiscal 16 and increases over time to $1 billion in fiscal 2020. There's already been one round of FASTLANE grant applications. The last round of applications were due in December of 2016. We're waiting for the results, but be looking for future calls for proposals under the FASTLANE program. The purpose and eligibility is not as direct as the deployment program, but it does include projects to reduce highway congestion and bottlenecks and to improve the safety, efficiency, and reliability of the movement of freight and people, which AV and CV certainly can do. The last two I want to talk about aren't specifically called out in the FAST Act. However, they're supported by programs that are, and they're administered under FTA. The first is Mobility on Demand Sandbox, or the MOD Sandbox program, which is an interesting name in and of itself. It's authorized under Section 5312, which those of you that work with transit agencies are familiar with. That initiative envisions a multimodal, integrated, automated, accessible and connected transportation system in which personalized mobility is a key feature. It's funded at $8 million, and the last round allocated was in October 2016. Right now, it's not clear if FTA is going to do another round of MOD sandboxes. However, we have heard that that may happen in the coming year, so if you're interested in implementing AV and CV technologies in a transit application, that might be interesting to you. The last one is the Safety Research and Demonstration Program. It's authorized at $7 million. Its proposals were due in October of 2016. The results were just announced. However, that program will be active in the future years of the FAST Act as well. I think it's worth mentioning, too, that there's another grant program that has already concluded, and it will only compete once for the duration of the FAST Act, and that's the University Transportation Centers program. The UTCs are located across the country. They are active in a number of different focus areas, but the UTCs that are active specifically in the areas of safety and congestion reduction will most of the time have some research program in automated and connected vehicles. If you're interested in working with students and academic partners on evolving technologies, partnering with them on proposals, I would urge you to reach out to the UTCs in your state or the national UTCs. I know, gosh, there's We've had several UTC directors that are actually here, and we're always looking for opportunities to work with private sectors and agencies on all manner of initiatives, including AV and CV. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that resource, as well as partnering with universities just in general. But the UTC program does fund this type of activity as well. All right, the core programs, the formula programs, there's a lot of them. I will just use a few of them as an example. But generally speaking, if ITS activities were previously allowable under a program, V to I, from the infrastructure perspective, probably is too under the new bill. The FAST Act does add language to a lot of the existing programs that specifically authorize V to I and connected technologies that weren't there before. Now, granted, there may be a list of eligible activities, but they are specifically calling them out in a lot of the existing programs in a way that they didn't before the FAST Act, which is encouraging for those of us that are active in this field. For example, the Highway Safety Improvement Program and the National Highway Performance Program both specifically allow as eligible, quote, installation of V to I communications equipment, unquote. That was not in there before. A few allow automated vehicle activities too. For example, the ITS program now requires DOT to implement activities that assist in the development of cybersecurity research to help prevent hacking and spoofing, and malicious mischief with automated transportation vehicles. So that was new as well. Now, these programs list, and there's, like I said, I do have the list of all of the FAST Act authorized programs with me. If you're interested in talking about the details of what's allowed under each one, seek me out afterwards. We won't go into all of that now. But I do want to point out that, for all of these programs, there is a list of things that they're eligible for. So decision makers have to decide, am I going to go after this V to I communication thing under this program, or am I going to use these formula funds to install new traffic lights or fill potholes or whatever else is allowed under that particular program? And I think decision makers really don't have the information that they need right now to make those decisions. It's up to us as an industry to provide that information to them. For example, if you spend the same amount of money on automated and connected vehicle technologies as opposed to something else, how does that benefit? I mean, what is the cost-benefit ratio? And I think that is that's a piece of information that I think that we have an obligation to provide to decision makers. The big picture, I don't know if some of you saw a couple of days ago, Elon Musk was at the TED conference in Vancouver, and he was talking about the future of transportation. And he talked about that he envisions someday cars carrying passengers at 124 miles an hour atop skateboard-like platforms that will whisk through tubes underground. The cars slide onto the platforms at street level, descend down an elevator, and then automatically go flying through the tunnels. He also talked about the Hyperloop, which some of you are probably familiar with, which are tubes above ground that can carry cars at jetliner-like speeds. Now, I throw this out there just to remind you that we don't know where technology is going to go in the future, and the woman that was talking about Lyft and how far we've come in the last 5 years, I think really drove that point home. We may go from where we are to something like this in the future. But I really think it's our responsibility to prepare our lawmakers for passing legislation that allows us to adapt and grow as technology does. So with that, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Melissa, for that very comprehensive overview. All right, so I think we'll go to John next. John, why don't you provide some remarks here on this?
Thank you. Emily, I just want to ask you, though, if Lyft is like Spotify, will Taylor Swift come and pick me up? Oh! I'll just stop there because I'm going to dig a deeper hole. So I've been asked to talk about infrastructure investment and policy for connected automated vehicles from the state level. And with all due respect to Secretary Chow and the U.S. DOT, they're doing all they can with what they have. But let's face it, it's not enough. Congress has continually kicked this can down the road. We're up to 35, 36, 37 continuing resolutions. And I would submit to you that you cannot plan for a 21st century transportation system and make this country economically competitive around the globe based on continuing resolutions and the percent GDP that we're investing in infrastructure. So from my perspective as a state DOT director, the folks that build, operate, and maintain the interstates and the state highway system, the policy choices get very difficult. And I'll run through some points here very quickly, and then hopefully we can generate some discussion. But I spent 12 years in the legislature as director of research, 6 years before that at Motor Vehicle Division, and now since 2009 I've been running the DOT. And these are the kind of things that we observe, is that when it comes to connected and automated vehicles, the desire for them often outweighs the projected cost and what the policy lifts are. In other words, people want it, and they want it easy, and they want it at no cost. They just think it should somehow happen in that equation of transportation funding. There's two parentheses, and inside the parens it says, and here is where a miracle happens. There's a disconnect of policymakers. They believe that tech is cheap. They have no idea of the investments that go into not only coming up and manufacturing this technology, but the cost to put it into the infrastructure. And then, of course, we have to be careful, because I remember one city that had all these Wi-Fi boxes they were putting up and around in the late 1990s, and the technology moved on, and guess what? They had a lot of boxes stuck on telephone poles that no one ever used. There's a belief that private industry somehow is going to solve all these issues, that somehow the innovation and the money that private industry brings will just, again, miraculously produce these for the road at no cost to the taxpayers. Demonstrable return on investment. This is where we come to this decision-making problem with folks that run DOTs. Do I do pavement or do I do technology? One of our senators said, hey, you know, the Tiger program is just immensely popular. And it is. But when you consider that states are applying for $50 billion worth of need to a $500 million Tiger program, it's like throwing a raw chicken into a pool of alligators. Of course it's popular. It's the most popular thing out there because we're starving for revenue. So when you look at, do I put down pavement? Do I go with some new technology? You have to say, what are my citizens telling me? What's our governor telling us? What's the legislature saying? How many people want to go out and cut a ribbon on a new, signal phased and timing traffic system? They want to go out and cut ribbons on bridges and new projects. So very often we're forced to choose between the two. And there's a belief that technology will replace this need for investment, that somehow, some way, we're going to have this beautiful world that we're talking about, but we don't have to spend any money because the tech is just going to solve it all for us. So here's some public perceptions. Technology is good. It's great, but it should be free. Don't make me the taxpayer pay. I already paid for the system once, right? Why should I have to pay for it again? I don't like politicians who raise my taxes. Find another way. I know. Use those P3s out there. Because obviously those private industry folks, they're very altruistic. They like to come and give me money to go build things, but they don't expect me to actually pay them back, right? So while P3s are a great tool for financing, I would say a lot of us have financing tools and plenty of them in the toolbox. What we lack is revenue to draw that financing down. If a life is lost, it's the system's fault. And so as we get into these connected and automated vehicle realms, as a state agency, we tend to be very leery of litigation, because I don't care how closely you build it to the spec, if it's absolutely perfect, if there's a life lost, I can pretty much guarantee you there's a lawsuit coming your way. And so what you find is states are very cautious when they're introducing new technology, and this is something that we're going to have to get over if we intend to move this quickly. Demonstrate that your department is not asleep at the switch. Oh, the pressure on DOT directors. You know, over the past, 7 years or so, governors have really looked at connected and automated vehicles as some kind of economic development source. I want them in my state, and I want them now. Well, we can't all have them. They're going to pick certain areas where they're going to go, but we have to be able to ask ourselves as DOT directors, do we keep chasing the latest thing, or do we focus on what we have to do today with another eye on the future, but not the expectation that we can do all things possible under the sun? So here's some things that are going on in Arizona. We've got several companies that are testing in Arizona cities. We purposely, at the state level, have worked with our legislature to not enact laws to restrict companies from coming in. Right now, if you've got a person in the vehicle, that's pretty much it. You're good to go. And we're working on this control issue to say, well, if there's a person in control of the vehicle, but they're not actually in it, does that count under our laws? So we're trying to make the testing arena as welcoming as possible for companies that want to come in. So it's a very non-regulatory approach. We're trying to remove barriers. The governor's focus in our state has been very much on the economy. And so he's established a committee that is in charge of looking at connected and automated issues. They report directly back to his office. But again, it's how do we remove the barriers, and especially in the trucking arena, because as we look at the I-10 corridor, and it was pointed out to me, it doesn't stop here in Texas, it goes all the way to Florida. How do we begin to reduce that friction using the technology on a commercial basis so that we can start to boost the economy from that area? We've got a test bed in Maricopa County. Faisal, where are you? You in here? He's one of our engineers from Maricopa County, and they are doing lots of work with signal phase and timing. The U of A, our University of Arizona, is working with Uber, and we also have state government talking about what Emily was saying in the future. Do I want to own a fleet of iron that's sitting in the parking lot so it's out there convenient when a worker wants to get in and go to another site? Or do I want to contract with a company, and if I need to go to another office or another place, I simply call a rideshare service, and state government does not have to own large fleets of vehicles. We're working on the platooning issue, and then, I want to mention the I-10 Corridor Coalition because we have to think big. A 20 intersection signal phase and timing project is important to learn from, but eventually we have to expand this system well beyond that. And with all due respect to my friends in the city, we've got to be able to feed those economic engines that the metropolitan cities provide, but we have to be able to feed them through the interstate state highway system. So we have to make this, as has been pointed out, work more like a system in the future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, John. All right, Carla.
Hello, I'm Carla Taylor. I'm the Chief of Staff for the Austin Transportation Department. And thank you, John, for your comments about state impacts, because I would say that they also apply to cities, especially in terms of revenues and the decisions that we have to make. I had the honor and challenge of corralling the City of Austin and regional response to the US DOT Smart City Challenge, the $50 million grant opportunity. I call that a mega grant, and with a mega grant, you need a mega response, and I think that's what we did. We had nearly 200 people touch and contribute to our grant in one way or the other. About 100 of them active contributors. We had dozens of writers and experts in this process. I think we had a darn good proposal. We made it to the finalist stage, but we didn't win the money. We would have loved to have that money to help advance and look to the future for autonomous and connected vehicles. That said, we still think that we had a lot of winning opportunities out of that grant. We worked across silos in transportation departments. We reached out to a lot of the research institutions, including TTI, Texas A&M TTI, UT Center for Transportation Research, Southwest Research Institute, and we now affectionately refer to them as the Texas Research Triangle. We also worked very collaboratively, I think, with a private sector We had tremendous outpouring and offerings of public-private partnerships and donations to help us move down this path. As a result of the Smart City Challenge, there's been a spin-off, if you will, a loose confederation of Texas cities for more of a Texas statewide smart city and mobility opportunity to share learnings across the cities. So we feel that we've had a lot of tremendous wins out of this. Still within the Austin region, we're working collaboratively to help advance smart technologies. As the DOT challenge offered us the opportunity to look to the future, now we're focused on that, which is really terrific. We also now have to figure out how do we manage that future? How do we pay for that future? How and what infrastructure are we going to employ and invest in? How do we make the decisions on what to invest in terms of the technology is changing incredibly rapidly and not on the same time continuum as our procurement schedules and payment schedules? Do we go with investing in sensors, or do we go with data services to get travel information? I think Ginger mentioned it earlier. Do we invest in the striping and signalization and signage that's needed to make autonomous vehicles safer? What's the return on investment for cities, and what price points? I would say we probably collectively just in signage and striping spend $5 million a year in the city of Austin. We don't hit every stripe every year or nor the signs. If a higher level of visibility and connectedness is required, it will double and triple those budgets. So these are really very real challenges for cities, and with increasingly diminishing or stretched budgets and no new revenue sources coming in, it makes it very challenging for us to want to look ahead but not necessarily have the resources to do so. And last but not least, we do find that there are great opportunities for public-private partnerships, and we'll talk more about that. But as we do so, we have to do so in an equitable fashion to meet all parts of the populations in our cities. It can't be just a collaboration and a financial transaction with private sector partners. There has to be investments in our total communities. So thank you.
All right, before we open it up, everybody, I hope they're thinking about your questions that you want to ask. I think I want to circle back to our two kind of agency representatives here. Both of you posed lots of questions, I heard in your remarks. And so I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on what you think the steps are moving forward to begin to try to answer those questions.
Well, I'll start, and most of my questions revolve around the choices you have to make based on available funding. And when you're looking at the future and say, well, what kind of funding model should we have? I want to be careful we don't have paralysis analysis. Obviously there are lots of things happening out there to gasoline-powered engines. But in the meantime, we're still suffering under gasoline tax that was based on 1993 revenues at the federal level. That's buying you about 40 cents today, given inflation, fuel economy, and the other factors. However, nothing yet has presented itself that is as easy to implement, and so until we get to this new model, whether it be VMT or something, what are we going to do in the meantime? And part of the problem I face, and maybe it didn't come across, but there's a lot of public apathy out there when it comes to transportation investment. In most cases, people are fairly satisfied with the system. You don't hear them pounding on the doors of Congress or calling to say, hey, bring me that automated vehicle sooner. I want it tomorrow. Get out there and do something to invest in those roads. It's more about a lot of other different things that they tend to focus on. And let's face it, transportation is just not that sexy compared to some of the other issues facing Congress. But it's one of those necessary, basic, foundational things that I believe we've forgotten. And I've talked to over 500 businesses in the last 4 years about investment in transportation. They get it. They know that in order for their businesses to prosper, they need to invest in the system. We've talked with legislators, we've talked with mayors. They get it. They know they need to invest in the system. Where the problem seems to come in is that many of them have taken pledges over the years not to increase taxes or fees under any circumstances, and they now find themselves into a box. What are we going to do about the system when we know that every $1 billion we spend produces 26,000 jobs, and on the research we've done in Arizona, there are 17,000 ongoing jobs for at least 20 years after that $1 billion is spent. But they can't get over the hump to make that decision from a leadership perspective that yes, the medicine tastes bitter when you have to raise taxes, but the medicine is good for you because eventually the sickness is worse than taking the cure.
Carla?
I'd agree with that. I'd also say that for the private sector versus the public sector, I would say that cities are probably years, if not decades, behind the private sector in technology advances, in data usage, data management, storage, analytics, and all the above. That puts cities at a great disadvantage educationally. It puts them at a disadvantage in terms of, or just behind the curve in terms of knowing if we realize we have to employ new data sensors and analytics, software, edge computing, storage, invest in data scientists, then we also need to equip our cities with those types of expertise, the technical expertise that historically in the transportation sector they really haven't had. Our transportation engineers don't have a strong background in technology, not the ones today. They need to be, that needs to be part of their education going forward. So we have to bring on new technologists and experts in fields that we haven't had before. That requires resources as well. We need those kinds of staff so we can determine what's the right kind of technology for us. What's the best return on our investment? It's not something you can just ask a vendor to help you with. Everybody's got their own vested interests. So there's a lot of learning that needs to happen with cities, and I think, so in addition to the resources, there's a huge learning curve that we have to come up on.
Well, and just to that point, those internal resources are extremely critical. Real life example, when I took over DOT, we had 4,500 full-time positions. We're down to under 3,700 people now. Our budget was slashed by $100 million in those for our operating budget. So as you're looking at this, DOTs are doing all they can to keep the system up and running with far less resources. It's not that the departments out there are bloated and bureaucratic. It's just that the pie is just not big enough to go around anymore.
Right. And then when you have to you start looking at how, if the pie's not getting bigger, then we have to carve it differently to invest in the type of infrastructure to support connected automation. What's the value proposition for doing that? And I think there's a lot, I think you were alluding to some of that, just understanding what that value proposition is. So let's open up for questions, and Scott was raising his hand here. I think he wanted to ask something.
So clearly, federal legislature doesn't have any stomach for a gas tax increase, but many states are in fact doing gas tax increases. Arizona proposed a gas tax increase, but then backed away from it. Texas just implemented a gas tax increase in 2016. Can the states and localities fill the gap?
Well, my answer to that is yes and no. Partly they can, but let's look at it from this perspective. And again, going back to a systemic perspective, The reason states have done that is because the pie does keep shrinking. And yes, it did go down in Arizona. Even conservative Wyoming managed to get a 10% increase. But I could not get there with our legislature and leadership. So when you look at it from that perspective, the states can provide part of this, but then we get into this whole issue of what I call balkanization. And we lament the patchwork that we have out there, the haves and the have-nots. And I would say that if you truly want to keep an interstate system, state highway systems compatible, functional, technologically equal in most respects, then we're going to need help from both sides, because our unmet maintenance needs in Arizona total nearly $500 million. And there's no place I can come up with $500 million to do maintenance. And so from that perspective, yes, the states can help with those kind of needs, but we also need, I believe, federal help in order to keep the system relatively homogeneous in the future.
So Carla, I know the city of Austin was successful in a bond referendum recently.
Yes, we were, and we were able to, and we're going to be putting those money towards infrastructure. So, but that really doesn't help for operating dollars, for operations and maintenance. And certainly when we invest bond dollars, it's $720 million, it's really for hardscape improvements. It's really not for technology. It's not used for technology, because the hardscape improvement and the amortization of those bond dollars is like a 20-year life cycle. Technology is a fraction of that. So our bond council says, no, you really can't use it for technology. We're going to stretch the definition a little bit by putting in some technology into our new smart corridors, because we have to create baselines. And so we're going to do what we can within the certain confines of our bond restrictions. But state tax gas dollars don't also flow down to cities. For 75% of the populations in most states, they're not getting the money back in gas tax. It's going to the highway system, which is important, state highway systems, but it's not coming down to cities. So cities still don't have a good revenue source for autonomous and technologies.
Yeah, see, in Arizona, we share roughly 50-50 with the cities and the counties. So the gas taxes do trickle back down. But I like your approach, because our mantra is anymore when we're looking at risk, is anybody going to go to jail? No? Let's do it.
Right. We stretch a lot.
Okay, we had a question back here.
I'm interested in the, setting aside Elon Musk's just ridiculous, this was a ridiculous announcement. He knows less about how you all do your job every day than my grandchildren, and I don't even have any grandchildren. So, but there seems to be a chasm between the way, there's certain external things that you have limited control over, which is the funding. But there's a chasm between, say, what Lyft is talking about as it relates to geofencing and having a fixed environment where automated vehicles may operate, and also the way systems are handled today. So Austin, for example, as a city, when you have a work zone going on, or when the system is changing, or routes are being rerouted, effectively communicating that information in a platform that could then get to a company like Lyft so that it could filter out into its quote-unquote geofenced area. I wonder if you could talk as it relates to what are some of the systems you've identified that you do have control over, either from a process standpoint or from just a business standpoint, where you say, we need to make some process changes, things that we can control to prepare us for this future, in both how we develop projects, how we maintain them, and how we communicate that information both to the public and to these companies. They need to take that information and, with very little latency, get it out to the people that are actually out in the field.
Well, I'm happy to say from Austin's perspective, we started the process. More than a year ago, we started a contract with the University of Texas Center for Transportation Research for taking our transportation data from our traffic management center, starting to warehouse it, archive it, analyze it, and also give us some visualizations about what the traffic patterns are, et cetera. We're adding new data streams every way that we can, and so we can not only keep it in an open data format, but make it available ultimately to the lifts and the entrepreneurs and in various forms and fashions to the public at large. And ultimately that will also draw in, traffic signalization data and traffic flow. As new sensors come online, we'll be able to, show near misses at intersections and based on noise vibrations and those kinds of things. So all that we hope to flow into this data center, if you will, that should be available to the public. We're also collaborating and trying to collaborate with TxDOT and our transit agency and other groups about collapsing and coordinating all that different data together in one system, because travelers don't care what road they're driving on or et cetera. So we're going down that path. Again, it takes money and effort to put your data systems out and make sure they're coordinated and in such a format that's digestible. So we're getting there, but it's a process.
So from the state perspective, well, first let me say every Texan I've ever talked to outside of Texas hopes that when they die, they go to Austin. They consider it heaven on earth. But from our perspective, what we did was 2 years ago, as we watched what was happening in AASHTO, we carved out a new division from our old highways division, and that's what we call our TSMO division, Traffic System Management and Operations. So we're grouping not only engineers, but law enforcement in there with incident management skills and training to train first responders. So we're looking at then how we begin to market it, because through dynamic message signing, even though some of the public say this is a waste, we like to come up with things like, driving while intoxicated goes together like peas and guac. So there's a lot of things that we're seeing we can do to communicate, but then there's also a lot happening in private industry. Do I go out and invent an app from the DOT when travelers are already getting good information based on the data they're harvesting from us and from other sources? So I think you have to take your organization and look at it and structure it so that while you're planning and designing, you're thinking, how do I incorporate these at little additional cost, these other infrastructure issues? If you're going to go out and do signing anyway, and let's say that double D barcode is easily there on the signs, why not put those up for the future? As long as you know those things are going to be used and your investment's not going to sit idle. But again, you have to have that conscious push, I think, not just from the senior leadership level, but all the way through the engineering and incident management departments.
Other questions right here?
What are your thoughts on alternatives to the gas tax, such as a VMT tax or adaptive congestion pricing?
Well, those are two pretty good ones, aren't they?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, we've looked at we looked at all 50 states and the way that they collect transportation revenues. And, although I don't believe gasoline tax will be the workhorse in the future, it works pretty good from an evasion standpoint. It's involuntary. You can't help but pay it. It's a little regressive, but we started looking at, can you do some sort of road user fee and charge people a higher rate when they go to register their cars, things like that. Do you look at other automotive products? But essentially the bottom line is this: it's not so much the amount, I should say that you can calculate the amounts that you need. That's simple mathematics. But how do you get the public to buy into that and vote for it? Because what we've seen in our state, since we allow for public initiatives, is that very often when there's a tough question before the legislature, especially involving a revenue increase to the state or taxes, we'll refer that to the voters. And so they put it on the backs of the voters, and if you don't have them educated on the return on investment, obviously it's going to go down. So the question really is, what will the public bear in that? And you can put it together any way you want. VMT is very interesting. We're part of a consortium that involves Oregon and California and Texas, and I think New Mexico's in it and a number of other states, and they're looking at VMT. The problem we run into in my state is that it's full of folks who are afraid of black helicopters, and when they know that the government is tracking where they're going from a mileage perspective, they get a little upset with that. Even though they'll take that smartphone and tell anybody where they're at any time of the day, they don't want government to know. So Oregon's got a pilot program. They're using a voluntary reporting, and I think that works for a pilot, but at large, when you look at it, are people really going to come in and tell us truly how many miles they've driven, or do we have to have some way of recording that? So, you know, there are other ways to raise revenue. It's just what's the public going to bear?
All right, I think there was one here, yes.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and what we're realizing, what we're seeing in some other places starting is buying technology as a service versus technology as a product. So we're not buying sets of software, sets of hardware, but we can work with companies to provide this service for a certain amount of years, and with the belief or understanding that as the technology evolves, it will be included in the service. And then you can rebid that service later on. I don't think our procurement group is there yet, but I think they're starting to look in that direction, and we'll help nudge them along.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it's a great point that you bring up. It's very difficult, and I'll use an example. 2 years ago, I was approached by a company about electronic license plates, and the plate will put your number on the back of the vehicle electronically, but while the car's parked, it will show advertisements and other messages. And so we were very interested in piloting that on the state vehicles, just as something new to try to see how it goes, because as you know, fixed license plates present a number of problems. We just awarded the contract last month for the pilot. 2 years is what it took to work through those things. We very often get offers for, let's say, LED lighting or something like that, where a public-private partnership wants to form, and out of the savings you might generate from that LED lighting, they would go ahead and put the system in and take part of the savings back as payment. It sounds very simple, but once you're trying to replace a 1990s 480-watt system of sodium bulbs with LEDs, you never realize the problems you run into from a procurement standpoint. And finally, what happens is because of the way the procurement is structured, the company just drops out. So there are some definite issues with procurement we have to tackle.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
So have you projected what the gas tax is going to produce if the Lyft and other advocates for electric vehicles or substantially better fuel mileage vehicles? To me, with inflation and with the improvement in mileage and the conversion of cars to electric, the gas tax will become even less. Yet as a voter and a taxpayer, in Texas, I thought Dallas did a great job with its toll roads, but the general opinion of tolls and congestion pricing, which I think is wonderful, is very unpopular, and the state legislatures picked that up, and it's almost like a plague. So you got to change the public. How do you do that, and what efforts are there to communicate how bad it's going to get?
So it's very interesting on a number of fronts that you bring up. How do you change the public's mind? I don't know that you can change all of them, But I think what's more important is how do you give your elected officials air cover if they have to go and force people to swallow that bitter pill? Because let's face it, politicians are human beings and they're driven by election cycle, and many of them from either side of the aisle don't want that big tax word hanging on them when they run for re-election. So I think you have to work with your business and industry to give them some air cover. But this is what you run into is if you want to put something like this forward, the private sector very often has to help you invest in the public education campaign. And if you're going to ask them to put millions of dollars in a public education campaign to get people to vote for something and to do the demographics and marketing, they have to be pretty certain that this investment is going to go in the direction where the voters are going to approve it. So that's a big issue right there. I don't know that I agree with the electrification that's been brought up as solely the future. The trade magazines are talking a lot about hydrogen coming back, especially in the commercial vehicle industry, as processes to separate the hydrogen out are becoming less and less expensive. You know, CNG is being built in stations across the country by Yellow Freight, Knight, Swift, all of the major transportation companies. Its carbon footprint may not be as clean as electricity or hydrogen, but it's pretty much a drop-in technology. So I think what has to happen is that you have to look at the propulsion mode of the vehicle and then somehow assess that. If it's electricity, we figure the average vehicle pays $180 in gas tax a year per Arizona. So I would do the calculation and say to the electric vehicle owner, you're going to pay $180 at the time of registration on top of the vehicle license tax. And you can split that up in different ways. We've talked about doing it monthly and things like that. So it's possible to make those mathematical choices.
Carla, do you have anything? All right, good. Well, John, Carla, thank you. Melissa, thank you for sharing your thoughts this afternoon. It's been a very interesting panel. Please join me in thanking our panel today.